Hey guys, it's Lewis from Recycle Bicycle Sales here. In today's video, we're going to give you 5 reasons why you shouldn't buy a cheap bike. I'll be honest, we use that title for a little bit of clickbait, but jokes aside, I think if we're talking about getting into cycling, there's a couple of things that I think we should avoid if we're looking at a cheaper bike. I'll just contextualize and say when I'm talking about cheap bike, what I kind of mean here is sort of $500 and less. If we're looking at a bike below $500, I think there's a lot of good points in this video that might teach you some things. If we're talking about getting into cycling as a hobby, not just transportation, I reckon we want to be looking at a bike sort of $1,000 and upwards, because I think if we're in that sort of price bracket, we're going to avoid a lot of the issues that we can come into throughout this video. So what can actually make a bike considered cheap? Well, I reckon there's a couple of things. The first one could be the age of the bike. Maybe it's quite an old bike, or maybe it was just sort of cheap from new. Maybe when they bought it brand new in the bike shop, it was $1,000, and now in the secondhand market, it might be worth about $500. So if you're looking for a bike in any of those categories, this is the perfect video. Stick around and take some notes. So first things first, poor build quality. Maybe just the frame in general is made of some sort of cheap material, or the welds aren't very strong. So if you're out riding along the footpath and you needed to drop off the curb to join onto the road, you don't want the frame to bend or snap or twist out of shape. So you want to make sure that it's a nice, well-built, good quality bike. I'm going to be honest here and say, if it's a brand that you recognize the name of, you can probably make a pretty good assumption that it's probably quite well made. Whereas if it's some cheap Chinese Alibaba kind of frame, that might be the one that you probably can't trust quite as much as maybe, you know, your Trek or your Giant sort of thing. Lots of the older bikes might still have a really good quality frame. They might be made of steel or aluminium or another strong type of metal. But whereas these newer bikes, if they were just cheap from new, maybe they might be made of a relatively low quality material. And if I'm being honest, if you're getting a bike in that $500 bracket that has a carbon fiber frame, chances are it's either crap or stolen. If you still reckon that the bike looks awesome on the internet and you're determined to go and check it out, even in that price bracket, there's nothing wrong with that. I would just recommend when you do go and have a look at it, have a close look at the welding marks where all the different tubes plug into the other tubes there. Have a look around the welds. Are they starting to crack? Is it starting to disbond or sort of unstick itself from each of these welds? That would be one of the things that I'd look at if it's an aluminium frame. Or even, does the bike ride in a straight line? The bike could be bent out of shape or sort of twisted out of shape, and it might feel like it's riding along sideways, almost like a crab. They're probably 2 things that I would look at if you're determined to go and check the bike out anyway. They can also be a bit heavier and inefficient. By that I mean, if the bike's a bit heavier and you're trying to ride up a hill, you have to push against gravity a little bit harder, which can just make the whole riding experience a little bit more sort of strenuous, I suppose. Even like the wheels might be heavier, so they're harder to speed up and harder to slow back down. Again, not an issue, but it just does make it a little bit harder to fall in love with cycling if you have to put that little bit of extra effort into it. Maybe as you're riding along and you're trying to change through the gears, it might not be quite as quick to change across, so you might have to wait for it to actually drop into the gear. Even things like the bearings, if you've got a heavier weight bike and it's putting more load onto those bearings, they might not last quite as long, so you might have to get more regular repairing and regular maintenance done on the bike. Perhaps even the tyres might be made of an older, more brittle material. If you're buying a pre-owned bike, they might be older and they might need to be replaced, so there might be more money that you need to spend there. If you're looking at a new bike that's in that price bracket, it might just have a smaller ratio of gears. So you might have 2 at the front and maybe 7 at the back or so. So you've only got 14 gears. Whereas on one of these racing bikes, you've got a wider gear ratio, so you've got more choices of what gear you want to be in when you're going up the hill and back down the other side. And this one probably goes without saying, but they're also a little bit less aerodynamic than one of these slightly newer or slightly more expensive bikes. Again, it's not a big deal, but I think if you're talking about doing cycling as a hobby, getting a nice fancy bike might make it a little bit more fun. On this bike that we've got in front of us here, the gear cables come out of the side of the shifter and they sort of go around through the front and then they find their way through the frame. It just means that now you've got a little bit more of a bird's nest sitting out in front of your handlebars as you're riding along. Again, not a crazy big deal. In my opinion, I think it looks a little bit ugly compared to one of these slightly newer bikes or slightly more expensive bikes, and it just makes the whole riding experience just a little bit more enjoyable. Old bikes and cheap from new bikes will usually have low quality brakes and gears as well. So when you're really relying on those brakes, when a car pulls out of a side street, you want to trust that those brakes are going to pull you up in time. Sometimes the braking distance on these sort of cheaper brakes, I suppose, might not be quite as good. It might take you a little bit longer to actually slow down. Or maybe if you're coming into the finish line and you're racing your buddy to the coffee shop and you're both sprinting along and you're trying to hit a gear, since you've got a lower end componentry, a lower end gearing and drivetrain and chain and everything there, it might be a little bit slower to shift across, and under load, it could even throw the chain and then it'll derail the chain completely. In this price bracket, we're probably looking at a rim brake bike. We're probably not quite looking at a disc brake bike. In this price category though, I think the rim brakes that we're looking at tend to be a bit more of a low quality. So it might just be worth just noting that, I suppose. A little bit less powerful. And if you were to find a disc brake in this price category, I would just be a little bit cautious. There might be a reason that it's going for cheap. If it's a second-hand bike, there might be a reason that it's cheap, or maybe it just might not be a very powerful brake. Nonetheless, if you'd like to know the difference between rim brake and disc brake, we've actually done a video further back on our YouTube channel comparing rim brake with disc brake. Not that it might be a big topic in this price category, but it might be a fun video worth looking at anyway. I might even just quickly mention with the wheels as well, and just that whole circle area down there, wheels, tires, that kind of thing. If we're looking at a cheap from new bike, the wheels tend to be a lower build quality. So there can be a couple of trade-offs there. They might be a little bit heavier, but it might even be that there's a lot more spokes on there and it's harder to keep the wheel perfectly straight. If you were to hit a pothole out there, it might completely buckle the wheel and you'll have to bring it into the local bike shop to get a wheel true done so they can bring it back straight. Since there's so many spokes there and it's a lower quality build, it might be a little bit more difficult to keep it perfect all the time. One of the most common reasons that I have these cheaper bikes coming in here into the workshop is to do with having buckled wheels. They've hit a pothole or they've bumped into the curb and the wheels just haven't handled it very well. So it is a genuine concern on bikes in this price category. And if you're looking at a mountain bike in and around that $500 price category, I would expect to replace that rear wheel eventually if you case a single jump. They just don't handle it very well. In that price category, they're more for riding to school and a little bit of off-roading on the weekends, not so much the jumps and that kind of thing. Also, if you're looking at an older bike, it's a pre-owned bike that's quite a few years old and it's been sitting in the shed for a while, the tires might be getting quite old. And when the tires get old, the rubber tires, they can start to get dry and they can begin to crack. And that's when they'll start to lose grip and they can get punctured even easier. So if you are determined to go and check out the bike, when you're having a look at the wheels, you can also have a look at the tires. We're looking at the sidewalls on both sides and the front and back, and making sure that there's no cracking. You can even look at the top of the tire, as in the bit where it will actually be touching the road, and making sure that it's not starting to split there as well. I would have a look at this if I was looking at a pre-owned bike. Also, the upgradability of these older bikes or these cheap from new bikes is a little bit more limited than a fun, more expensive bike like this. Things like, if I looked at that rear cassette, if we're trying to go up a really steep hill, a really common thing that people do is that they want to put a slightly bigger cassette on so that they can get up a steeper hill a bit easier. On a sort of cheaper bike or an older bike, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to fit a larger cassette on there, so you might be limited as to how big you actually can go, which is going to make it a little bit more difficult in the hills. On that same point, on an older bike, sometimes they have a 5-bolt system on the chainring, whereas most bikes these days have a 4-bolt system on the chainring. That means if you wanted to change the size of the chainring, it's going to be a little bit difficult to find a new chainring to fit that chain. A lot of the time with these older bikes, there's an issue with tire clearance. We're talking about how big the tire can be that you can actually fit in the frame before it touches on the frame. Back in the day, 23mm was the way that everyone would be, and then 25 came in a little bit wider, and now, especially on these disc brake bikes, a lot of people are going to 28mm. If you've got an older bike and you're trying to put 28mm tires onto it, the wheel might not be able to spin completely. So that could be perhaps an upgrade that you might want that you can't quite have. So bottom line is, if you're trying to upgrade parts in the bike, you might be limited as to what can be upgraded. So that might be worth thinking about before you go and buy a $500 bike. And a bonus one that you might not think about before you're buying the bike is the resale value. If you bought a bike for $500, it might end up losing about half of its value. So you might only be able to sell it for about $250 maybe, if there's someone out there looking to buy a bike. But I would also say, if somebody's looking at spending $250 on a bike, they might be able to save up a little bit more money and they might be able to buy a $500 bike brand new. This is maybe less of an issue if you're buying a used pre-owned bike, because they probably already had quite a bit of depreciation. Whereas if you're buying a brand new bike for about $500, as soon as you roll out the door, it's worth about half that. And if you've used it quite a bit and all the components are now worn and you go to sell it, it might be worth less than that again. But with all things considered throughout this video, this isn't me saying don't buy the bike. I'm just saying, if you're looking at getting into cycling as an actual hobby, not just a transportation kind of thing, I think you want to be on a slightly nicer bike. for all the different reasons that we spoke about in this video. And if I'm being honest, I think the more expensive bikes just look cooler as well. It shouldn't be a variable, but I think it kind of is. But with all of this being said, if you've got $500 and you really want to buy a bike, go buy that bike. Don't not buy the bike because I'm telling you that a more expensive bike's better. Of course, a more expensive bike is going to be better. But if $500 is where your budget is at, you'll fall in love with your bike anyway. So if I have convinced you and you are looking to buy a slightly nicer bike, $1,000 or above, pop into Recycle Bicycle Sales and we'd be happy to help you out. We've got so many different bikes in stock and we can run you through the different price ranges and sizes and all this sort of stuff that you might need to know before getting into cycling. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope I've given you some things that you could look at when you're looking at a $500 bike and some reasons why you might want to look at a slightly nicer bike. If you reckon there's anything that we've missed, or maybe you disagree with something that I've said in this video, let us know in the comments below. I love to hear all of it. Again, this isn't saying don't buy the bike. This is just saying maybe save up a couple extra dollars and just squeeze up to the next price category if you can. But you're not going to be disappointed with any bike that you buy because it's always more fun on a bike. Otherwise, I'm going to say thanks for watching and we'll see you guys in the next video. See ya.